Hello and welcome to this small tutorial on the skull bones. In this tutorial I plan to cover the cranial bones, the facial bones, and bony landmarks and features that you can find on many of the facial and cranial bones. I also will plan to talk a little bit about some bones that are associated with the skull. So our first bone in this frontal view will be the frontal bone. So it's a major bone right in the front, so it's a pretty easy one to remember. Associated with the frontal bone is the supraorbital foramen. Some people have a notch there instead of a foramen. Foramen means hole. So this particular notch or hole is where a cranial nerve and where blood vessels will travel from the brain and through and out to the face. The maxilla is this large facial bone that is located right in the front, and it is a pair of bones. Maxilla is singular, maxillae is plural. And associated with the maxilla is the infraorbital foramen. Again, a cranial nerve and blood vessels will travel through that particular hole. Also associated with the maxilla is the alveolar process. These are ridges where your teeth basically fit into the maxilla. On older people, you can really see them very easily, but if you run your finger across the maxilla, you can feel the little ridges where your teeth are sitting inside of the maxilla. Also in this frontal view, you can see the mandible. So it's the large jaw-like bone that allows for chewing to occur. And associated with the mandible is the mental foramen. Additionally, there are blood vessels and nerves that travel through that particular hole as well. Later on, we'll talk about the cranial nerves in later lectures, and you will know which cranial nerves will come through these particular holes. Your cheekbone, also known as the zygomatic bone, is located right there. You have a pair of those, one on each side. Also at the base of the nose, we have a pair of nasal bones. It's kind of hard to see in this particular view, but there is a bone right inside of the orbit of your eye called the lacrimal bone, and we'll see it in a better view in just a few minutes. Also within the orbit, you can see other bones. Here's the sphenoid bone. This bone can be seen in different areas of different views, but this is one area that you can see it in. We also have the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone will also be seen in other dimensions as well, and it's a bone that you can also see inside of the nasal cavity. So it does make up the nasal septum, which divides the two sides of your nasal cavity. So this is called the ethmoid bone. Associated with the ethmoid bone is going to be the middle nasal concha. Conchae would be plural, concha is singular. So you do have one on each side. We do have another additional bone called the inferior nasal concha. You have one on each side, left and right. And this is a scroll-like bone that has mucous membrane wrapped all on the surface of it. And it helps all that mucous membrane helps to clean the air as it comes into your nasal cavity. Additionally, there are blood vessels there, and anytime you get hit in the nose, you can expect a lot of bleeding because of all the blood vessels wrapped around these conchae that are inside the nasal cavity. Also within the nasal cavity, you can see the vomer, although it's better seen in a different view that we'll see later. Alright, so now we're going to take a lateral view of the skull, and we can see the frontal bone. We've already looked at this bone before. Making up the wall of your cranium is the parietal bone. You have a pair of those, and we'll see the pair of them in a different dimension in a little bit later. On the back of your skull, you have the occipital bone. And then near your temporal area would be the temporal bone. Associated with the temporal bone is the external acoustic meatus. This is a hole that leads to the tympanic membrane and allows for airborne sounds to hit that tympanic membrane. We also have the mastoid process, which is the attachment point for some of the muscles we use in chewing. Actually, in turning our head from side to side. So the mastoid process has a root mast, which means breast. So it does have a breast-like look to it. And then we have the styloid process, which is a bone that does anchor some of the muscles that we have for chewing. In this dimension, or view, you can see the sphenoid bone. We saw it also when we looked at a frontal view, and we'll see it in another view, in a cut view of the skull. Here's your zygomatic bone, just as a review. And we have a little bit better view of the lacrimal bone in this particular view. There is a hole there that's somewhat represented by this picture, that your nasal, your tear secretions will travel through that hole from your eyes into your nasal cavity. So oftentimes when you cry, your nose starts running because some of the tears will actually travel through that hole and go into your nasal cavity. Here's a review of your maxilla. And we do have some places where bones come together. These are places called sutures. So this particular suture right here is called the coronal suture. So it does do like the coronal cut that you learned about earlier. And this is called the coronal suture. And you can see your frontal bone and your parietal bone come together in this particular suture. This is the squamous suture, and this is a connection between multiple bones, the sphenoid, the parietal, the temporal, and the occipital will be basically coming together along this particular suture. We then have the lambdoid suture. This suture, when you look at it from the back view, looks like the Greek letter lambda. So this is connecting your parietal bones and your occipital bones, and this is called the lambdoid suture. Now we're looking at the skull from a top view. Here you can see the nasal bones and the frontal bone. So just to review some of your bones, we have the parietal bone, and you can see it's a pair of them. Pariet means wall, so it does make up the wall of your cranium. We then have the frontal bone towards the frontal region of the body. A couple sutures you can see here would be the sagittal suture. So the sagittal suture is connecting two parietal bones together, and it does do the sagittal cut. And then the coronal suture, you can see, connects your parietal bones and your frontal bone. And again, it's the coronal cut through the body. From a back view, we have the parietal bones that you can see, the pair of parietal bones. And we have the occipital bone. Associated with the occipital bone would be the external occipital protuberance. And this is a bump that you can feel on the back of your head. Males have a little bit larger bump than females, and it's an attachment point for muscles. And then we can see the sagittal suture connecting the two parietal bones together, and then the lambdoid suture connecting the parietal and the occipital bones together. We're now looking at the skull from a bottom view, and we'll review the bones and bone parts and surface landmarks as we go through this. So our first bone is the zygomatic bone. We then can see the bottom portion of the maxilla, and yes, your teeth are anchored in the maxilla. So that's a maxilla. Maxillae, again, is plural. So making up the back part of your hard palate of the roof of your mouth is the palatine bones. So you do have a pair of them on each side. And then we can see the vomer in a different kind of orientation than we did from the frontal view. So that's the vomer. We can then see the bottom portion of the temporal bone. Associated with the temporal bone, we have the styloid process, that little anchor for some muscles to connect to. And we can also see the external acoustic meatus, the place where airborne sounds goes into and strikes the tympanic membrane. Also associated with the temporal bone is the mastoid process. In this particular dimension, you can see a portion of the sphenoid bone. This kind of makes up the bottom of the cranium. We'll see the sphenoid in one other different dimensional view in just a few minutes. And then we can see the occipital bone from the bottom view in this particular picture. Associated with the occipital bone is the external occipital protuberance and the occipital condyle. The occipital condyles are a pair of bony landmarks. These are rounded surfaces that will articulate with cervical vertebrae number 1. So they make a nice smooth articulation with the vertebrae. And then we can see this large hole here called the foramen magnum, which literally means big hole. And this is a hole through the occipital bone that allows your spinal cord to go into the vertebral canal of your vertebrae. So it allows the spinal cord to exit, through the cranial bones. A bony landmark that I couldn't show you earlier is the mandibular fossa. This particular picture shows it a little bit better. And this is a depression that allows for your jaw to articulate with the temporal bone. So it's a little smooth depression called the mandibular fossa. And it does make up a joint called the temporal mandibular joint. And this happens to be somewhat of a problematic area for some people. There may not be a clear articulation with that. There could be rubbing and friction that develops, so that could be a problem for some folks. We're now going to look at a cut view inside the brain. So you can see this is a cut skull, and we're going to be looking at the interior of the bottom floor of the cranium in this next picture. So inside of this cut view, you can see the frontal bone. You can also see a new bone, the ethmoid bone. We did see this from the frontal view earlier, but this is the ethmoid bone from a top inside cut view. We also can see some of the parts of the ethmoid bone. One of them is called the cribriform plate, and this particular plate cribber means sieve, so it looks like a sieve or like a spaghetti strainer. And it has little holes that little nerves will dangle down into your nasal cavity, which allow you to have a sense of smell. So we have a sense of smell because we have the cribriform plate allowing nerves to dangle down into the nasal cavity. Also associated with the ethmoid bone is the crista galli. Crista galli is literally means the crest of the chicken. And if you ever see a chicken with a red light crest on its head, this is what this part was named after. So it is a crest-like structure. We can see the sphenoid bone in this particular view. It's this large bone that looks kind of like a butterfly or a bat, and it makes up the bottom of the cranium. And there is a part called the sella turcica, which is this part the arrow is pointing to. And this is a part that houses the pituitary gland, which is a gland that we'll talk about second semester. And so that's called the sella turcica. Here we have the temporal bone from an inside view. We see the parietal bone from an inside view. We also can see in green the occipital bone, and there's that foramen magnum, or the hole the spinal cord will exit through. Bones associated with the head would include the stapes, the incus, and the malleus. These are the three inner ear bones you have inside the temporal bone at the very end near the tympanic membrane. This is a dime just showing you how small these particular bones are. So they are very tiny bones, and they do make up your the three bones make up bones in the inner ear, actually in the middle ear. And so airborne sounds come in, they strike the tympanic membrane, and the tympanic membrane will rock these three bones, and they will transmit that signal to this little flap of skin right here that's connected to the cochlea, which is the part that allows you to hear. So these are the auditory ossicles, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, the three smallest bones in the human body. The last bone that's associated with the skull is the hyoid bone. This is a bone that will connect many of the muscles in your throat and muscles of the tongue. So this is called the hyoid bone. It's located under the mandible, and it's a bone that oftentimes is overlooked. So this is a simple tutorial of the skull, and I hope that this will help you learn the bones that are required for this particular course.